Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement interview with Experts series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement, and your host for this series. Without any further ado, I want to introduce our wonderful guest today, Dr. Jann Freed. Jann is a professor of business management emerita at Central College and the Mark and K. DeCook Endowed Chair in Leadership and Character Development. She's also adjunct professor for the University of Iowa. As a leadership development coach, consultant, author, facilitator, and speaker, Jann helps organizations improve employee engagement, navigate change management, and develop leaders of all ages and career stages. She's written or co-written 5 books, given 2 popular TEDx talks, and is a certified Saging leader through Saging International. She also hosts the podcast series Becoming a Sage, which she interviews thought leaders about wisdom in work and in life. Jann's personal mission is to continue to learn and share what she's learning with others as a wisdom seeker. She often says she likes teaching but is passionate about learning, and that this book has changed her life. So the book we're going to be focusing on is Breadcrumb Legacy, How Great Leaders Live a Life Worth Remembering. And I've had the honor and pleasure of reading the book, and I can attest to that. I think you're all going to enjoy listening to Jann, as well as I really encourage you to read the book. And I think you'll hear why as we go forward with the interview. Jann, welcome. I am so glad you're back.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, Dory.
Thank you. And I did interview Jann a while ago, and that interview is part of the podcast series on her earlier books about the wisdom of leaders. I don't think that's the exact title of the prior book, but
Leading with Wisdom, Sage Advice from 100.
Right.
Sage Advice from 100 Experts. Yeah. And that came out in 2010, I think. No, 2013. That came out in 2013. Yeah.
And your new book just came out this year. It's brand new 2023. So
that's correct.
Why don't you share with people your idea for Breadcrumb Legacy? What is that all about?
That's a great question, Dory, because with Leading with Wisdom, that was based on more than 100 interviews, but my editor liked 100. Really, some of the top thought leaders in the field, and we've lost some of them now. Warren Bennett, William Bridges of transitions work, and we've lost more. But anyway, I analyzed the research, and each theme then became a chapter in the book. And one of the themes that emerged was called Leaders Live Their Legacy. And I found that there were actually 2 chapters that really resonated, 2 themes. One was about legacy, and the other one was called Leaders Don't Let Ego Win. And so I created workshops and had some speaking engagements on both of these topics. And one topic was, I called it How to Create Your Leadership Legacy. And it really, people were very interested. And so then I decided to do a deep dive into legacy work. And what I realized is, I would say to people in workshops, or I would ask, when do we leave our legacy? And people would say, when we leave. And I'd say, leave what? When we leave a job, you leave a career, you retire. I said, that's true. When we die, when we leave the earth, I said, that's true. I said, but what happens when I leave this workshop today, or I leave this speaking engagement, or you leave a meeting, or we're leaving our legacy all the time in bite-sized pieces. And so the more I describe this, we're leaving crumbs and with interactions, with what we say, how we interact with others, our conversations, all of these are breadcrumbs. And they're not all positive. If we're not aware of it, we could be leaving a lot of really negative breadcrumbs along the way. And they tend to accumulate. And so then I decided I'm going to do a deep dive into legacy. So then I started interviewing more people, because I've often said that if I could have anybody's job in the world, I'd love to have either Krista Tippett or Terry Gross of NPR, because I just absolutely love to interview people. I went about interviewing people on, again, thought leaders, on legacy, on leadership. The subtitle is How Great Leaders Live a Life Worth Remembering, but really the subtitle could be How to Live a Life Worth Remembering, because the most important person to lead is yourself, ourselves. And it's really for anybody at any stage, any age. But the publisher, which is Routledge out of London and New York, she said to be searchable and findable and whatever, I want to have leader or leadership in the subtitle. But that's how the idea came about. And I'm finding that it's really resonating with people. And what's interesting, Tori, is I started working on this probably in about 2018, I want to say. And then with COVID, it became my COVID book because speaking engagements, workshops, that all just froze in time. So it became my COVID book. Death became front and center. And people of all ages really started thinking about what's life all about? How am I spending my time? We called it the Great Resignation. Sally Helgeson called it the Great Reckoning. Then we had quiet quitting, all of this because people were saying, and death was front and center. So all of a sudden people are thinking, am I living my life in a way that really matters to me? So it was a perfect storm in a strange kind of way.
Oh, it really was. And I think the concept, but also the perfect storm of COVID, trying to find meaning, purpose, all those buzzwords that are there, just it all comes together beautifully in your book.
Thank you.
And I think you've given the listeners a little idea of what a breadcrumb legacy is. And you've got some wonderful examples. Maybe if you could talk a little about your realization of the breadcrumbs that were impacting you and what led to the really establishment of this concept that I think works so beautifully.
Sure. I trademarked the concept breadcrumb legacy. And what became very clear to me is it's a daily, intentional, you're very aware of what you're doing, how you're interacting, what you're saying, how you're behaving. And we're people. We're not perfect people. So also in the book, I talk about forgiveness, compassion, empathy, because we're not perfect people. We make mistakes. But if we can correct those mistakes, if we're aware of them, but on a daily basis, thinking about before we say something or behave, react, a knee-jerk reaction, think about what kind of impact am I having? I'll share a quick story. So I was doing a workshop on this, and one man in the workshop was a corporate workshop, and one man said, don't you find it self-centered to be talking about your legacy or thinking about your legacy on a daily basis? And I said, no, but let's not use the word legacy. Let's use the word impact or influence. What kind of influence am I having on this person? What kind of impact am I leaving or having on this person? And if you think about impact, is that self-centered? And he said, oh, no, now I get it. Mm-hmm. So it's really the daily, intentional, very conscious philosophy of how you want to live your life. And that's why I say it's changed my life. Not that I'm a totally different person, but I'm very aware of what kind of impact am I having on others. And because as I said, legacy is not always positive. And we could spend a lot of time talking about people who have fallen from grace very quickly. And it's hard to earn that back. It can be done with a lot of intentional and effort, but it's difficult. And so that's where I think I'm coming from, thinking about how do I want to be remembered? And really then legacy thinking, and I talk about this in my book, is forward thinking. So you're not looking in the past. You're saying, how do I want to approach this next conversation, this next interaction, this next meeting? You're thinking ahead so that you can have the impact that you would desire.
Which is so important. It's tied in, and I know in the book you mention Ellen Langer, for example. She's somebody I interviewed really not very long ago. That whole idea of the noticing and the paying attention and being intentional. And I really think we all do want to be remembered in little ways. And you talk about legacy with the little L. It doesn't have to be the big L.
Yeah.
Just like purpose doesn't have to be the big P. Talk more about
Right.
that, because I think it's so important for everyone to hear that. There's all these little things that really matter.
It is. And I do have a chapter in the book called Embracing Death. And I actually did a TEDx talk called, and it's on YouTube, it's called Embracing Death, Seeing Life Through a Different Lens. And because one of the things that happens is people think of legacy at the end of life. We often think of legacy when we're approaching, and the end of life can come at any time. But we often think of it in later stages, or if we're ill and we have a terminal illness, what kind of difference am I making? But it's really the small things that can make a big difference. And it's interesting, I might mention that I have a monthly newsletter, and if they go to my website, jannfreed.com, 2 N's and 2 E's, they would get a monthly newsletter that's easy to read, and they would get a monthly podcast. But in one of my most recent newsletters, I talk about this woman that I discovered, and she studies obituaries, and I do too. But anyway, but she said, after studying hundreds or maybe thousands, I can't remember, she said, it's the little things that people remember about others, not necessarily the big things. So that's where, again, breadcrumbs, you're thinking of crumbs. I'm not talking about, so little things where many people think I'm not rich enough to have my name on a building or donate thousands of dollars for a cause, not Mother Teresa where I'm saving lives. It's little things, and we can each do little things. Could be tutoring, could be just focus on your family and grandchildren, or could be tutoring others or mentoring others or volunteering. I'm a hospice volunteer, and with each patient, it's really a gift, and I learned so much. Could be a little thing, feeding the homeless through your church or through an organization. We can all contribute and make an impact, and I think that's really important. So anyway, that's where I get the kind of the breadcrumbs. And so it doesn't have to be big and gigantic, and those are all big myths. If you think little L, what can I do? Because the little ones, and the big ones too, but they accumulate. They tend to be behaviors or patterns. You're not just feeding the homeless once. You might do it monthly, or I don't have one hospice patient. I've had several, and they all add up. That's where I'm going with that, Dory.
Great. And I can't remember who the person was, but I love the quote. Maybe you can put it to the right person, but that all the crumbs bread actually lead to the loaf.
Yeah, I know. I don't remember exactly who said that, might be, but they do. They accumulate into something bigger than what you're even thinking. With several of my books, I didn't really set out to write a book. I set out to answer a question or do research, and then one thing leads to another, and it ends up in something bigger than what you might imagine. Yeah.
Couple of things. Since you mentioned the death, and I really like that chapter, and I know also for myself that early experiences with death, and really with a particular person who I became a confidant for, has helped me in my understanding of how really dealing with death helps us see life as more precious. Talk more about that if you would, because you said some of your students call you Dr. Death. Because you're upfront about it. And talk more about that if you would.
Yeah, very good. And actually, in the TED Talk or TEDx talk, I described exercises that I have students go through. And these were typical undergraduates, age 20 to 22. And so I described that. But I am obsessed with death, dying, grief. And grief in particular, because there's so much pain going on in organizations in the world right now. And COVID again brought death front and center. Not only are people dying, but industries, companies, some of our favorite restaurants never reopened after COVID. COVID really put a pause on so many things, and many things did not recover. And so this whole idea of learning to deal with grief and loss and coping mechanisms. I just got done reading a book just last night called Hurtwood, I think it is. And every chapter, what was the name again? I think it's called Hurtwood.
Hurtwood. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Barbara, and I'm drawing a blank on her last name, but I think the subtitle is Live with the End in Mind. And so each chapter is about a death experience that she has. It's really excellent, and because each chapter is different. But you can read a chapter a day. It really does bring life into focus. And there are plenty of people who talk about NDEs. I first got involved or heard about near-death experience through Tony Robbins. And he's a motivational speaker. But talking about we don't need to have actual near-death experiences to really appreciate life. And it really is one of these concepts that I would talk about death so much. My students said, well, I'm just going to call her Dr. Death. But the whole idea that it can happen anytime. I'm not wishing it. I don't want to hurry it. But I want to be able to live my life in a way that I appreciate every day. And so it really is another philosophy. And I think even more so than death, but this whole idea of grief, because as I said, a lot of people don't understand grief, and most people don't want to talk about death. They don't want to think about death. But don't think about your own death, but think about what we have lost and what we are losing and what are some positive and healthy coping mechanisms. I think that's really important, because if we are in a leadership position, which means that we influence the lives of others, we can't help others through grief and loss if we don't understand how we are coping with it. So I think those are important concepts. And like I do a deep dive into the book on that. Yeah.
And I think that chapter, and it's interwoven throughout the book, is so important. And it ties into the not taking life for granted. I know in my 20s, I did have actually a near-death experience, and some strangers saved me. And it really, for me, was a pivotal time of just learning every day is precious and don't take it for granted. And it's so much of the theme of your book. And I really, I think it's so important for people to recognize that. And it ties into the noticing and being intentional and the breadcrumbs. Could you tell us about, I'm shifting a little, but I know there was this important mentor that you talk about in your book. You actually start with him and end the book with him. Talk about that and how he influenced you, and this notion about what we learn from others and what we can pay forward.
Yeah, I love that question. My professional mentor was a man named Elmer Burak. And I met him through a professional organization in Chicago. He was the director of the PhD program in management at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I described in the book at the very beginning how I met him. But I met him at this professional conference, and then I just knew that he was someone who I could learn from. And so I said, can I take you to lunch? He said, you don't have to do that. And I said, no, I want to get to know you better. So I took him to lunch during one of those days during that first conference. And then every year after that, I would manage to get together with him because he rarely went to that conference. In fact, I think he said that was the one and only time he went to that conference. He became a professional mentor, and I wouldn't have any of these books if Elmer had not mentored me. And so I learned from him. And Elmer, he was my Maury, Tuesdays with Maury. He was my Maury. And he was so wise and smart that I was like Mitch Albom. I wanted to go, so I wanted to stay in touch with him. And Elmer was so smart and so ahead of the curve, but he was not wild about technology. Now, he knew how to use it, but he said, Jann, if you want to talk to me, write me. He said, I believe in handwriting. He didn't want emails, or he said, pick up the phone and call me. He said, I want that personal touch. And so Elmer, I met him, I think it was 1993, and he passed away in, I think, 2011. And then I became friends with his wife, and she and I stayed in touch, and we could talk about Elmer after he passed. But he had such an impact on my life because I knew that he would give me good advice. And he was there in a time of crisis one time. He was always there cheering me on, giving me such smart, good advice. And then I could pass on that advice to my students because I was still teaching full time. He had such an impact on my life in so many ways. I've got the last chapter is a way of reflecting how Elmer lived the concepts in the book, even on death. Like I met him in Chicago, And I went to give him a hug, and he had like this back brace on. And I said, Elmer, and he was a cancer survivor. I didn't know that. And he shared that with me. And I said, Elmer, I need to know these things. He said, Jann, I'm 80. These are bumps in the road. We're going to have them, but life goes on, and I'm doing fine. And he had embraced it. He embodied the concepts in the book. So that's why I use him as an example of living the major themes in the book.
And you also talk, and I think one of the things I love about the book is you give a lot of suggestions. But in terms of mentors, can you talk a little about how people can really find role models for themselves, people to listen to? I think you bring in the intergenerational aspect, but I'd love listeners to think about how this breadcrumb legacy can be both giving, but also how we allow ourselves to receive and be mentored by others.
At the end of each chapter in Breadcrumb Legacy, I have what I call breadcrumb ingredients for embodying those chapter concepts. And one of the questions or suggestions, I guess I should say, that I give in workshops or if I'm speaking to a group, I say, who's living a life that you admire? And you may or may not know them. But if you admire their life, what is it about their life that you admire? And if you have a chance, and you don't have to know them well, maybe you know them from afar. Do you have a chance to set up a coffee with them? For instance, there's a woman here in my local area, and I do admire her. She is a professional woman. She's just recently retired. I think she is probably in her early 70s. But she had her own business, very successful business. She was a professional fundraiser. So you would hire her to manage and lead a $50 million capital campaign, that kind of thing. And she sold her business, but I admire her because not only is she a professional, but then she's also very involved in the community. She has 18 grandchildren. Now, I think I'll be lucky if I get a total of 3 out of 3 sons, okay? But 18 grandchildren. I used to say to her, how do you even remember all those names? I mean, or birthdays. And she says, I group them up because I'm lucky. Most of them live here. I group them up. And now I forget their ages. But she might say from 10 to 13 and from 13 to 15. And then she says, I group them up and take them on activities. And she has what she calls grandmother camp, where she will bring them all together and they have color-coded T-shirts. So I intentionally went out. I said, I want to take you to lunch. I just want to learn how you navigate this life because it just sounds complicated, and I admire you in so many ways. So I guess the point of my story is I think it's important to be proactive. What can you learn from them and take them to coffee or lunch? And if that's not possible, then just continue to observe them. What is it about them that you admire? And can you learn from them? My husband and I, because I'm into the staging work and I interview people about wisdom on life and work, and I say I'm out to retire, the word retirement, he and I are always talking about how we see the next phase of our life and how do we want to live that. And we're to the age now where people are retiring. Some people are buying second homes. Another good friend of mine, she and her husband bought a very nice RV, and they're traveling around in that at certain times during the year. Some people are renting, some people are buying second homes to escape. I'm in Iowa, escape the Iowa winters. My husband and I are always talking now, does that look attractive? Does that sound appealing? How do we want to live that part and spend our time? Some people are moving to be near their grandchildren. I have one grandchild who's 18 months, but she lives in New York. I don't see us moving there. I have a son. He's the only one who's married. I have 2 unmarried sons, one in Kansas City, one's in San Francisco. I don't see us moving there. Again, but I think the key is, and if reaching out, being proactive and being available, offering. I do a lot of pro bono things that would really fit into mentoring others, sharing information. There are all kinds of opportunities to do that. And I think you're right. It's both a giving and receiving.
And I do, before I ask another question, I just want to encourage people to go to the event page. And if you have questions you want to ask, those of you who are live on the call, please submit them and just say who you are and where you're from. I was thinking I was going to read the chapter names, but I decided instead I'd rather ask you to say, what are the main components that you've seen about living a life worth remembering and maybe thinking ahead to what's next? Let me ask you that question. Okay.
I do have a chapter on purpose and meaning. Why do you get up in the morning? And Richard Leiter out of Minneapolis is the purpose guy. I call him the purpose guy. But even in Blue Zones, Dan Buettner, it's all, do you have a mission? Do you have a purpose? And again, doesn't have to be big and significant. It's just, what do you look forward to? I can tell just a quick story. I was coaching a pretty powerful lawyer who's local in town, and he'd gotten a serious health diagnosis where he was not going to be able to do full-time legal work. But he wanted to talk to someone about what's next. And I'm talking to him and I'm giving him options. And he says, Jann, you don't get it. I'm done with working. I said, I'm not talking about working. I'm talking about, he said, I don't want to work. And I didn't even mention work. I just talked about how he might use his time. And I said, what's going to get you up in the morning? What do you look forward to? You're not just going to lay in bed. And he goes, oh, now I know what you're talking about. Purpose and meaning. And I've got a chapter. I think it's important to get your ego out of the way. I've got a chapter called Becoming a Nobody. And I actually did a virtual TEDx on that called Becoming a Nobody. And that's getting your ego out of the way, because so much of change or transition or moving on is hard to let go. And that's ego. That's ego saying, oh, you can't let go of that. And ego often leads to fear. So if you're going to live your best life, you have to really deal with your ego. As you mentioned, I have a chapter. I think it's important to embrace death and learn about loss and grief. I talk about relationships, and that's what I'm focusing on now, that as we get older, we have to continue to cultivate and nurture and sustain relationships. Now, we don't need a million friends, but what happens is people move, people die. I, unfortunately, am having several friends with health challenges right now, and they're not that old. And relationships and being there for them and supporting them. Relationship, your listeners might be familiar with the book it's a recent book too, called The Good Life by Robert Waldinger, and his TED Talk on, I think it's called The Good Life, the Longevity Study from Harvard. Yeah. Right. And if he had to summarize The Good Life in one sentence, it's about relationships.
Right.
And so I think that's a whole chapter in the book. So I think those are key components that people can zero in on. And as you said, I give ideas or suggestions on how to do this. One example, a current example, is myself and a neighbor. She said, well, I'll help you with. My idea was we have too much turnover in our neighborhood and we don't know our neighbors. And so we wave to people who we don't know, but we don't know them enough to knock on the door and say, can I borrow a cup of sugar? So I said, I want to have a cocktail party 5 to 7 on a Sunday night. I'll hand write invitations. I'll hand deliver them, put them in their mailbox. And I only want to invite people I don't know. And she goes, okay, I'll help you with that. And I want to get people in the neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood. We invited, I don't know, probably 12 or 15 couples, and they could bring kids if they wanted, and all people who we didn't know, and they probably didn't know each other. And again, in 2 hours, do I really know them? No, but now I know their names, I know who they are, and I think if I knocked on the door, I think they'd help me out. But again, notice how I'm being proactive and taking the initiative, because a lot of these things don't happen naturally.
And I think another chapter that you didn't mention, but it ties into what you're saying about relationships, is the chapter, Who Will Help You Move the Couch?
Yeah, that's a little about that.
Yeah. Exactly.
I can tell you, I'll just say, because again, I got that title from a true story. This is several years ago. And my husband said, I wanted to move the couch or something like that. And I said, can you move the couch? He said, can you help me? And I said, can't you call a friend? He goes, no, I don't want to bother them, or no, I don't know who I'd call. And I said, if you weren't here, I have people I could call who would help me move the couch. I said, you need more friends. And he didn't get offended. He didn't get upset. He just goes, what do you mean? And I said, honestly, because, and the reason why I'm glad you brought this up, Dory, is because women more naturally, and maybe it's society, but men, I think if we have a career, all of us tend to identify that with our career. But women, society allows women more freedom. We can have wine groups, dinner groups. We can go to movies together. We can go out to dinner together. Nobody thinks anything. But men are less likely. If I'm gone, my husband won't call. He'll go eat at a restaurant by himself at the bar, but he's less likely to call two male friends and say, do you want to go out to dinner? Now, men have power lunches, and they play tennis and they play golf, but they're less likely to get together and have, women will have knitting groups. They'll have sewing groups, quilting groups, book clubs. So I said, you love to read. Why don't you start a book club? And he goes, how do I do that? And I said, okay, here's what you do. You invite two people who you know. Now, I wouldn't encourage you to invite your best friends. You already know them. Invite two people who you know, who you like, who you also think read books. And then you have them invite two people each. And then you decide you're going to only have 10 or 12. And then you're going to meet new people. He did exactly that. He is so proud of it. He said it's pretty well organized. People don't like to miss. And now men want in the group. And so someone moved, and so they had a list of people who wanted in. And he's very proud of it, that he formed this book group. So once again, very intentional, proactive, and anyway, I'm proud of him because, and again, it doesn't have to be a book group. Think of something that you like to do. It could be a biking group. It could be, and there are groups. I say to people, you don't have to form your own. There are biking clubs. What is it you like to do? And join so that you meet like-minded people.
I think it's, again, in each chapter, you have these wonderful suggestions of how to reach out to people, how to include others, how to really enhance your life. And I know you talk about shifting, the words that you use that I like is shifting from a sense of scarcity, i.e. I don't have any friends, to abundance, and also shifting to a growth mindset. So maybe you integrate that in your book, but talk a little about that if you would too.
Yeah. Actually, I'll give you two more examples. Okay, so a friend of mine created what she called wisdom walks, and I love it. And she and a friend, and I happen to know both of them, but so the two of them invited 4 people each, but they made it clear, if you want to invite somebody, no limit to the number because we're all just walking. We meet at a common place. They said, I think one time they selected 8 o'clock in the morning, twice a month, one at 8 in the morning and one at noon. And clearly different people can hit different times. And once again, one time it was one of the first times I went, and I only knew the 2 people who had created this. And there were probably 8 people there. And it was like only one, myself and another person only knew 2 people, and everybody else they only knew one person in the group. So but again, you get to know people, and we walk for an hour and that's it. And you have conversation. So again, it's another way to expand your network of friends or acquaintances. And then you decide who you want to cultivate. Another example that is not in the book, and this is several years ago, I went to a professional conference, and it was at Charleston. And I had a friend who said, you must eat at this restaurant. So I made reservations at this restaurant, and I think I made the reservations for 6 people. And this was a national conference, and I didn't know anybody. But I wanted to go to this restaurant, and I didn't really want to go to a fancy restaurant by myself. So I'd go to a session, and I'm like, that woman looks interesting. I think I'll ask her. So I said, do you have dinner plans? She said, no. I go, I've got reservations at a restaurant. Would you like to join me? And she goes, sure. And then she said, do you mind if I invite so-and-so? No, great. So then I went to another workshop, and I'm like, that woman looks interesting. Would you like to join me for dinner? No, I've got plans. Okay, that's fine. No big deal. Go to another workshop. Would you like to? Yes. Can I bring along someone? Anyway, I had to increase to 10 because I had, and once again, the only reason I did this is because I leaned into it. I didn't want to be alone, so I just started inviting people. And again, people thought I knew all these people. No, I didn't know any of them. but I got to know them, and one person, two people in particular, I stayed in touch with, and they helped me with my Leading with Wisdom books. Again, proactive, take the initiative, get out of your comfort zone, and think abundance. I didn't think I'm going to be alone. No, I thought, okay. In fact, like I said, when I made the reservation, I made it for 6. I didn't know 6 people. Actually, I think I do talk about that example in my Leading with Wisdom book. So anyway, thanks for asking.
It's a great example. And the other person that I think has been a wonderful influence of you that I love too is the Mr. Rogers. You want to talk a little, because the whole be a good neighbor.
Exactly. When I was writing this book, both the documentary of Mr. Rogers and the movie about Mr. Rogers, where Tom Hanks plays Fred Rogers, both of those, while I was writing the book, came out, and then books about Mr. Rogers. And so I just got captivated because he, again, embodies when you talk about somebody who lived a good life. And he wasn't perfect. And he would admit, when he'd say, look for the helpers, look for the helpers. Just so many of his quotes reflect the themes in the book. And so then I have a couple pages on that. Again, a good example of living the good life. And once again, he was not perfect, but he would admit and he would know when he made a mistake or should have done something else. And I think was such a powerful influence on people of all ages, actually. I like you just the way you are. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. And it's just a beautiful example of ways to both reach out, connect, think about just the kindnesses that are part of the breadcrumbs of being intentional. I want to integrate. So Ellen from New York asks, what strategies do you have to address the unintentional legacy, the messages you send without even being aware?
That's an excellent question. I guess I want to reverse that and say, how can we become more aware of what we're doing so that they're not unintentional? Maybe another way to answer that question is, particularly when I was teaching full time, I've got a really easy feedback mechanism that I would collect feedback from students about every 3 weeks. Very easy, very open-ended. And because if I wait until the end of the course to collect feedback, which is your typical faculty evaluations, that feedback is too late to improve the course, because I've also written 2 books on continuous improvement in higher education. So I'm very big on feedback. And when I talk about this with leaders, I share this feedback mechanism. How do you know you're being perceived? What is your leadership legacy? And how are you being perceived? And if you don't know, then you could be leaving unintentional bad crumbs. With leaders, I share this feedback mechanism. And actually, I had that published. I did publish that in a book called Shifting the Leader. It's called College Assessment, Shifting the Focus from Teaching to Learning. And I did publish that feedback mechanism. But if somebody wanted to email me, it's just Jann Freed at jannfreed.com, 2 N's and 2 E's. I could share that instrument. But again, I think collecting feedback, because how do we know? And usually if we're in a leadership position, people will not tell us unless we ask. I will say that you have to create an environment where people believe that you want feedback. And when I was doing it every 3 weeks with students, they knew that there were no repercussions, that I wanted their feedback, and they started sending me feedback without me asking. Have you ever thought about doing this, Dr. Freed? Because I really think it would enhance interaction. I'm like, no, that's a great idea. I think creating the environment and then asking for feedback.
Again, I think that's great. And it ties into the idea of, if you're intentional and try to make even the unintentional intentional, there's less regrets. And I think that's part of what you're talking about in the book too, to try to live more intentionally so that there aren't as many regrets at whatever the end point is for any of us.
Yeah, that's very true.
I know you talk about the book as being timeless, and I agree that it is. Can you share a little on why you feel it's as timeless as it is? And I think your prior book too. I haven't read the early.
Yeah.
I've read both of these two books on the wisdom and this book on breadcrumbs. I haven't read your other books, but what helps make it timeless?
Yeah, exactly. I think a couple things. I think both of them have long shelf life. And I say that because it's not really what I think so much. It's what I learned from others. And I really worked hard to get some of the top thought leaders. So I'm not just saying this is what I think, but it's research based. And I think that gives it. And I also think the themes that emerge are really some of the big questions in life. What's life about? What does it all mean? What's the difference between life and death? And how can we control the ego? There are a lot of books. I don't know if I think you have interviewed Connie Zweig on her book. Yeah, I thought you did.
The Inner Work of Age.
From goal.
From role to soul.
Yeah. Those are age-old questions. What does it mean to go from goal to soul? And what does it mean? What's the difference between life and death? And how can we control the ego? And why are relationships important? I think all of these are endless philosophical questions where there really aren't answers, but they're worth thinking about in terms of how we live our lives. So I think that it's based on research and that these are really age-old and endless questions.
Yeah, no, I really agree. And what I like too is the way you structured it too, with all of the bread boxes with information from other people, but also the suggestions of things to do so that people really can think about if you're having trouble thinking about ways to be proactive, you offer it out there. You also talk about gratefulness versus gratitude. Can you talk a little about that?
Yes. First of all, I think it's a complicated concept, actually, but I think gratitude has become a buzzword. Keep a gratitude journal, and people will say, what are you grateful for? And I sometimes think it seems very self-centered. Oh boy, I'm glad that didn't happen to me. I'm grateful that didn't happen to me. I'm grateful I got this promotion. I'm grateful that I won that award or whatever. And it seems a little self-serving, where it's more of one book that I love a lot. And now I'm trying to think. It's by Christy Nelson. And I interviewed her. It's called Grateful Living. And really thinking about, just fits into the breadcrumb concept. Again, instead of focused on what you are grateful for, how can you live in a very grateful way? So it is a complicated concept, but I could Google that, but it's Christy.
It's called Wake Up Grateful, the transformative practice of taking nothing for granted. That's the beauty of your book, too. You've got all these great resources here.
Yes, I'll tell you, that's an excellent book. She also provides all kinds of examples. And one website that I financially support is called Grateful. I think it's just called grateful.org. And it was started by Brother, I quote him too. He's got a hyphened name. Anyway, it's a great website, and I financially support that because the resources are so wonderful. It's either grateful.org or gratefulness.org. Okay. Maybe they might have changed it to grateful-living.org. But Christy Nelson, and she was, if she still isn't, she was the executive director of that. But I would encourage your listeners to look up her book if they're interested in that topic, because it's the best one I have found.
Great. So it's Christy Nelson, and it's called Wake Up Grateful, the transformative practice of taking nothing for granted.
Yeah.
So I know you also, in addition to having all these great resources and suggestions, you shared some of the parting thoughts you delivered to some of your students about leaving breadcrumbs and living a purposeful life. Could you share some of them with the listeners?
Yeah. First of all, I think it just happened. I taught a senior management course. So it's the last course that students take as business management majors. And so I just started thinking about, and I started this, 25 years ago. And a funny story, I make postcards. It's just a hobby. And about 25 years ago, I bought a card, and I want to say I got it at Banana Republic. It was some clothing store, and it was a postcard that they were handing out, and it said something, I think it said, learn something new every day. And I thought, I like those, I call them quote cards, and I like those cards. So I started making cards that kind of reflected themes in my courses. I was teaching a diversity course, and so one was embrace change. And so I would make these kind of high quality postcards, and then I would hand them out to students, and I would say, here's a party favor for coming to class today. It reinforces what we just talked about. And students then started telling me how they hang them, they keep them, they post them, they frame them. We're doing all kinds of, because I said, don't take a postcard if you're going to throw it away. But if you're going to keep it or use it, it's the official size of a postcard. You could send it to somebody else. And so I was in, Dory, it's such a long story. So I would make these postcards. Then for my seniors, I started compiling those expressions onto one postcard. And then the more I taught, the longer the postcards got. Do you have?
I do.
The page?
So
yeah, what page?
I have the page. So it's on page 99.
Okay, hold on, because I've got the book here. Hold on. So the longer, so I taught full time for 30 years. And so I started it probably 25 years ago. And the longer I taught, the longer the list got, the bigger the postcard got. No longer was it it wasn't a postcard size. You had to use a full stamp because it became like a 5x7 and the font got smaller. I'll just share some of these, but and a lot of these came off of the postcards that I made. I'll just share some of my favorite ones. Okay. So embrace change. I mentioned that. Okay. Add value. So when I was doing my continuous improvement research, add value is cut out steps that don't add value. So I would even say to my 3 sons as they were growing up, I'd say, now make sure you add value. And if they got invited for an overnight, I'd say, now make sure you add value, make your bed, clear the dishes, add value. And so I'll never forget, my one son was probably, 12, and he got invited on a ski trip, and they brought him home. And she said, let me tell you, every time, your son would say, how can I add value? I need to add value here. How can I, when he's 12 years old, how can I add value? My mom says I need to add value. Another one here is quality is personal. That was my continuous improvement work again, that organizations only improve when people improve. And so quality is personal. Self-knowledge is empowering. The more about yourself, you gain power. And my organizational behavior course was all about helping them understand themselves and becoming self-aware and intentional. Question assumptions. That went along with my diversity course. Celebrate small wins. Again, I've got postcards for all these where I would send them to people. Celebrate small wins. Be an interested person. One of my quotes in the book comes from something that Jim Collins wrote in Training Magazine in 1999, where he said, don't strive to be an interesting person, strive to be an interested person. And that's all about internal versus external. It's not about you. It's what can you learn from others and ask questions. That's one of my favorite ones. Anyway, I only put in 15, but I think the actual postcard has about 30. So anyway, those are some of my favorites.
So it can be an incentive for people to get a copy of this wonderful book, because I think
there you go.
I really think it has a lot to offer a lot of people. And I just want to respect the time. And maybe if you can take a couple more minutes, and how has writing this book and the other book on wisdom, how has it changed your life, or has it?
Yeah, no, definitely changed my life. For this one, legacy is just top of mind. Breadcrumbs, top of mind on a daily basis. And again, I'm not a perfect person for sure, but I do believe in forgiveness, compassion, empathy, and making amends. If I've hurt someone or done something wrong, really trying to make amends. I think that's important. And the last book, Leading with Wisdom, I really think this book, as I mentioned, it's somewhat of an extension because of Leaders Live Their Legacy is in that book, and then I just dove deeply into this. But I do talk about death and dying in leading with wisdom too. So I think I'm really trying to practice what I'm preaching. Okay. I'm not perfect. I think that's really, and that's why both books talk about forgiveness, compassion, empathy, self-awareness. We're not perfect beings, but we can strive to get better. We can strive to improve. And to me, that's what life is about. If we make mistakes, how can we learn from them? I've got another mentor now. I guess I want to mention him. He's been in my life now since about 2011. And his name is Ray Rude. He's the founder of the Genesis group that I'm a part of. It's a leadership consulting group, but his favorite question is always, what did you learn from it? What did you learn? What did you learn from that conversation? What did you learn from that mistake? What did you learn from that interaction, that meeting? What did you learn? How can we process this? And I think, to me, that's continuous improvement, continuous learning. That's why my personal mission is to continue to learn and share what I'm learning with others.
And you do it so well, Jann.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you, Dory. That means a lot.
Oh, thank you. But I think that I encourage you to buy Breadcrumb Legacy, How Great Leaders Live a Life Worth Remembering. But I really do think it speaks to all of us. It's these little small steps, these little small breadcrumbs that matter. And I think we all want to be remembered in big or little ways. And I think your book's lovely.
Thank you.
Tell people again how to reach you. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I will say I am active on LinkedIn. I do have a private Facebook group called Becoming a Sage. You just have to request to be a member, where I'm really posting things about the next phase of life, positive aging, that kind of thing, on saging concepts. And my website, again, is jannfreed.com, 2 N's and 2 E's. And if you go to my website, there is a 20% discount from the publisher. Now, I will say it's slower than Amazon, and right now they might even be about the same price. I'm not sure. But I would ask your listeners that if you do buy the book, I would love it if they would write a 2-sentence review on Amazon, whether you buy the book from Amazon or not. 2-sentence review, and you don't have to write a good review. You can write an honest review, because I've heard that mediocre reviews are as powerful as mediocre reviews are better than no reviews. That would be a great gift to me if you wrote a review on Amazon. And I just want to get the content out there because I think that's my mission. That's part of my legacy. How might I impact others through the writing of this book? LinkedIn, my website. I'm somewhat involved with Instagram and Twitter, but not really. Private Facebook group called Becoming a Sage. Those are the best ways.
Great. And what final takeaway would you like to leave the listeners with before we say goodbye?
I think I want to reemphasize the fact that legacy doesn't happen at the end of life. It happens all along the way. And that if we're not intentional, we could be leaving a bad legacy, a bad impact on others. And that's not good. And we can think of all kinds of celebrities that have fallen from grace. And we can fall fast, but it takes a long time to build up. I think if we're intentional, we definitely can create a legacy that we're proud of. And that it doesn't happen at the end, and it doesn't have to be something big and monumental. It can be these crumbs along the way on a daily basis.
Great. Thank you so much, Jann, for being with us today. And again, the book is Breadcrumb Legacy, How Great Leaders Live a Life Worth Remembering. And I do think that you are leaving your legacy in these wonderful books you write and just sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. And mail me that address and I'll send a book.
Okay, I will do that. Thanks so much for being here today, Jann, and everybody who's listening. Take care. Stay well.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.